So hello and welcome to everyone that's attending. In the normal spirit of parliamentary events, we may have and we're hoping to have MSPs who will come and join us, but the nature of it tends to be that they may come in for a few minutes and then leave because they have other commitments and perhaps other events to also attend, but we'll see, and hopefully we'll get a few MSPs joining us today so they can hear what we've got to say on this subject. So I wanted to hold another event in advance of the stage 1 debate and vote, which was meant to be scheduled for next week and is now under a bit of discussion about when the stage 1 debate and vote will take place. I'm hoping it will still take place in January, but that's currently under discussion, to give an opportunity for anyone who wanted to ask more, particularly about the international aspects of this, because we often hear about the approaches that are being taken forward in lots of different countries, whether that's countries in Europe or much further afield, like New Zealand, and this idea about how do the approaches taken in different places stack up, what are the effects of those, and in Scotland, what should we be looking to, what's the best approach for Scotland. So we've got a very expert, I would say, lineup of speakers for us today, and we're going to kick off with Dr. Ruth Breslin. So she is the director of the Sexual Exploitation Research and Policy Institute, so that's most normally I think known as SERP, in Ireland, and she is joining us remotely. So over to you, Ruth.
Okay. So just to quickly say, as Ash said, I'm the director of the SERP Institute in Ireland. We started life as a research programme in University College Dublin, and a couple of years ago we transitioned out of the university to be an independent research institute. And we've been focused for nearly 10 years now on really trying to understand what's going on in the Irish sex trade. And we've undertaken studies on a whole host of topics in relation to this, and you can see them there. We are very much about gathering evidence and really trying to understand what's going on at the front line. Of course, the wider context of how the law is working, how the systems that women in prostitution find themselves in, how they're experiencing that. But it's very much also trying to understand from a kind of victim and survivor's perspective what's going on right inside the sex trade. So we work with a lot of victims and survivors and involve them in our research. And we also collaborate with kind of the major frontline research organization or the frontline service organizations and support organizations in that work. So I'm going to kind of cover two things in my short time today. One is the profile of those in our sex trade, because I think that's probably very closely aligned to the profile of those that you will see in the sex trade in Scotland. So it's to maybe look at how our legislation that we have here in the Republic of Ireland, how that applies to this particular group of people, again, perhaps mirrored in those involved in prostitution in Scotland. So we have looked across the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and probably none of this will surprise you, but in all of our analysis that we've done over the years, we see that a huge proportion of those in the sex trade are migrant women, often young, often vulnerable, and there tends to be only a fairly small number of local Irish women involved, and they also tend to be vulnerable and are often living with drug addiction and homelessness. And we see a huge number of nationalities from across the world represented in our sex trade, but it tends to be women. And of course, the trade is primarily peopled by women. When we look at the advertising profiles, less than 5% of those advertising the trade are male. The rest are women. There's about 6% of the trade are trans women. We see a huge number of migrant women coming from Latin America, Central and Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia. So all across the continents of the world, but that tendency for women to be coming from poorer parts of the world into the richer parts of Western Europe, including the Irish sex trade. Very young women, about a third of those we see advertised are between 18 and 25. At least a fifth in the samples that we've explored have been drawn into the trade while they are still girls under 18. And we see a whole host of complex reasons why women are drawn into the trade. It's direct coercion, it's trafficking, it's the push factor of poverty, or it's some combination of those factors. We see a lot of women with limited or no English, which makes them very vulnerable in terms of their dealings and negotiations with sex buyers and with prostitution organisers within the trade. Many of the women have an insecure immigration status, and many have no fixed abode. So I have actually met and interviewed very many women who I meet with their suitcase, because they are living out of a suitcase, and essentially they're living, sleeping, eating, moving around from brothel to brothel, and they're living, sleeping, eating wherever they see sex buyers. This is just a quick snapshot of a study we did with the frontline organisation Ruhama. These are the women. We did a big survey with the women in the service, and then we interviewed a smaller number of women. And I think this just gives a picture of some of the adversities the women are experiencing. These were just things that they disclosed in interview in terms of their backgrounds before they even came to prostitution. And there was a whole host of adversities that they'd experienced in their life before they even entered the trade. You can see them there: poverty, child sexual abuse, homelessness, early school leavers, substance misuse, all of those issues that you can imagine that already rendered these women very, very vulnerable to the further exploitation they experienced being drawn into and within the sex trade. I think I shared this previously when I gave evidence to the committee, but this is just, again, to give you a sense of the profile of who is in the trade. It's very hard to put exact figures on this. These are estimates, but in our kind of 10 years of doing this work, we think we've developed a pretty clear picture. So at the one end of this bell curve, you have those who would talk about having chosen prostitution. You know, they've chosen this. They see it as a job. Some of them will describe it as sex work, and they'll say that this is something that they chose to do. That they had a range of choices in front of them, and this is the one they chose. But when we look, kind of further into that, we see with those women in terms of their numbers that they represent probably only about 5% of those in the sex trade. And then at the other end of the bell curve, you have the women that kind of fit that very classic definition of having been trafficked into prostitution. There very clearly is a controller at play who has put them in place into the trade, and that controller, that trafficker, is profiting from their exploitation. And in the middle, we see this large vulnerable majority. So the trafficked women are probably about 10 to 15%. Those who have chosen are probably about 5%. And then we have this big, roughly 80% in the middle, who are very vulnerable. And when you talk to them, they will talk about having chosen prostitution, but when you kind of discuss their stories with them, it really is a choice out of no choice. They had very limited options. They're migrant women. They came to the country. They may not have immigration status in Ireland. They started with very limited English, and they are doing prostitution as a means to survive. They have no other way, essentially, to earn money. They have families at home in their home country, really relying on the income that they're earning, and they feel very responsible for those families. And it's very interesting with some of the women in this category that I've interviewed, when you track back to their very beginning story, in fact, they were in the trafficking section of this bell curve. They had originally been trafficked. They'd managed to escape the original trafficker, but at that stage, they'd been drawn into the trade. They were trapped and they had no other options. So they stay there and remain in this vulnerable category. So I suspect, you are experiencing in Scotland a very similar profile in terms of those who are involved in your trade. And I think that probably puts it into really stark contrast with who the sex buyers are. So the work we've done in Ireland on sex buyers shows that they're mainly local Irish men. They're mainly married or in a relationship, and they tend to be well-educated men with incomes above the average. And we've done various kind of analyses of sex buyer behaviours, but really what it comes down to is, I suppose, the way in which they're facilitating or engaged in sexual exploitation, because I think it's really important to point out that there's a very stark contrast between the profile of the women in the trade and the profile of the men who purchase sexual access to their bodies. And this, for us, is where the sexual exploitation comes in, because this imbalance of power means that these men are using their disposable income to purchase sexual access to the bodies of women and girls who don't enjoy the same status in society, economic status or social status, and who desperately need the money. So that's where the exploitative element comes in, and that's why we frame so much of our work in this context of sexual exploitation. Okay, so just to say a little bit about our legislation. I know that there's been a lot of discussion in Scotland and elsewhere about one particular aspect of the Nordic, or sometimes known as the equality model, which is the criminalisation of buyers. But I think it's really important to remember that actually legislation like this has a range of different purposes, and we were very cognizant of that when Ireland came to introduce this legislation. Yes, it is. The idea is to be punitive of buyers, to tell them that, the purchase of sexual access to another person's body is not acceptable. It is supposed to, at the same time, then act as a deterrent. And then it has this wider kind of declarative and normative aspect. And that was quite important in the conversations in Ireland when we were bringing in the legislation in 2017, was to say, do you know what? We have a society decided that is not acceptable for somebody with greater power and so forth to purchase sexual access to the body of somebody who almost always is is more vulnerable than them, and almost, seldom enjoys that same power. And another aspect, the first bullet point there that's really important, is also the protective nature of this legislation, which was also designed in the decriminalising of those who sell sex to be protective of individual victims and also to deliver justice. This is a young Brazilian woman I interviewed in a sexual health clinic who's engaged in prostitution. And I thought it was very interesting that she actually had, over time, gained some understanding of the law and where she kind of fit within it. So she said, her English is a little bit broken, but I think this quote does explain it quite well. She says, "I know my rights here also. Before I came," and then she explained to me that before she came to Ireland, she basically Googled what the laws were on prostitution in Ireland. And she said, "I know everything. And I know if the clients go looking for an escort, he have the fault also." So she said that sometimes she has a situation where men come to her, and after they've purchased sexual access to her, they threaten her and they say, I'm going to pay less, or I want my money back, because you didn't do this and this, all the things that the man expected and demanded. And she says that the buyer will threaten to call the police for her, and she will respond to them and say, "Really?" She says, "With me not, this won't happen. I know my rights. I will call the police for you." So she's able to understand herself that she wasn't the subject of law enforcement, that in this case, it would be the buyer who would be. These are just some quick recorded crime stats from our Central Statistics Office. This is just to show you how over time, and even before we introduced the legislation in 2017, women were no longer being criminalised. So this stat shows the kind of criminalisation for soliciting and related offences that women would have been kind of prosecuted with in the past. And you can see that this is going down and down over the years, and it's almost down to zero. And the couple of figures that you'll see more recently actually relate to sex buyers who are still soliciting women on the street, and that old law is sometimes being applied to them, but women are no longer being criminalised in Ireland for their engagement in prostitution. Then at the same time, we see the grey bars relate to brothel keeping, the red bars relate to recorded crime statistics around sex buyers. So here we see an increase in criminalisation, particularly in terms of those red lines in the bar chart, the increasing criminalisation, and it does go up and down, it does kind of vary, at the targeting essentially by the police, by An Garda Síochána, our Irish police force, of sex buyers. And you can see that that's kind of rising. Brothel keeping has gone up and down. It's gone down a little in recent years, rising, and is actually in the more recent figures is rising again, where the Gardaí have been engaged in focusing much more on the organised prostitution side of things and really trying to tackle those who are organising and running brothels. But something that's really important to mention, just in terms of that protective aspect for women, is that we have documented, and this is just a small example of them, we have documented tens and tens of cases over a number of years since our legislation came in, where women have been violently attacked in the context of prostitution, because of course we know that there is no law across the world that can actually make prostitution safe. No such law exists. Prostitution is an inherently violent system. So, women are still, of course, experiencing violence from sex buyers, but the difference now is that they're actually getting access to justice and achieving that justice. So we've documented tens and tens of cases of women who've reported assaults by sex buyers to the police. And this has been taken very seriously by the police and by the courts. Those perpetrators have been caught, they've been prosecuted. The women have been able to give evidence in court because they know that they're no longer the focus of the criminalisation. So they feel much freer to engage with the police, to give evidence. And there have been quite a number of successful prosecutions. And this was something we just never saw before the law was introduced in Ireland. This is just a couple of quick quotes from our current Minister for Justice, Jim O'Callaghan. So we're in 2026 now, earlier in 2025, March 2025, our Department of Justice released the results of the review of our legislation, and they concluded a number of things. So essentially, they concluded that our legislation is moving in the right direction. It is making progress towards those objectives that I've just described. But there have been a number of implementation problems. And I'm really hopeful that, and I think this is already happening in Scotland, some of the implementation problems that we've had in Ireland are already being addressed in the very thorough drafting of your new legislation. And I think that that's a really positive thing, because we have had some pitfalls and we have some areas where we need to strengthen our legislation, particularly around the targeting of sex buyers. So pretty much our Minister for Justice, our current Minister of Justice, Jim O'Callaghan, is saying that the focus of Gardaí's attention is not directed towards those in selling sex in the sex trade, who are exploited and victimized, but towards those who are responsible for exploiting them. So this is about shifting the burden of criminality, putting the attention on those who are responsible for exploiting women and also those who purchase and demand sexual services. And he concluded that his position is that prostitution is inherently exploitative of vulnerable persons, mainly women and girls, who are drawn in through a range of reasons: trafficking, addiction, homelessness, poverty, etc. And he says, he concludes that his key focus is to seek to reduce demand and protect those involved in the trade and support those who wish to exit, which of course is key. So I suppose I would conclude in terms of our experience from Ireland is that we've had a lot of success in terms of the protective element of the legislation. We have had less success in terms of the kind of punitive element of targeting the sex buyers, but we now have a range from our review that the government did. We now have a range of recommendations to really tighten up the legislation around addressing buyers, including introducing things like on-the-spot fines and other deterrents. And we've also had, I think, quite a good move towards this kind of declarative and normative purpose of the law, which is that we've had a national conversation about whether prostitution is something we want as a society in our country, and we've concluded that it isn't. So I think that, you know, today we're focusing on what's happening in Scotland. I think, as I said, there are some really positive aspects of our legislation that Scotland can learn from, and there's other areas that you might want to avoid or tighten up so they don't fall into some of the pitfalls that we had. But ultimately, I think this is the right way to go. And I suppose I will just finish on this point, which is that when we compare the different models, so sometimes we're talking today about the Nordic or equality model versus the kind of legalization or full decriminalization model, the one thing we always see is this issue of scale, that in countries that have legalized or fully decriminalized prostitution, the sex trade grows and grows. And we have not seen that since we introduced our legislation in 2017. Our sex trade has actually remained quite static. We have at least managed to hold the size and growth of it at bay during a time when many women are being pushed into the trade because of conflict and a cost of living crisis, etc., etc. So we've at least, even if we haven't done enough to deter buyers and to punish those who have engaged in sex purchase, at least we've been quite successful in holding the size of our sex trade at bay. And that's one of the powers, I think, of the Nordic model versus the decriminalization or full decriminalization or full legalization leads to a situation where this bell curve just grows. So yes, you might increase the number of those in this bell curve who've chosen prostitution, but with that model, you also massively increase the number of vulnerable and trafficked women in your sex trade. And I think that's not something that anyone wants. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ruth. That was extremely informative. Just to say to everyone who's with us in the room and online that we will have time for questions at the end, so if everyone can just hold them if they have any. And to also say that we've been joined by the Labour MSP, Katie Clark, so welcome to Katie. And our next speaker is also joining us remotely, was one time referred to by the former First Minister as that woman from the UN, but is Regan Al-Salem, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. Thank you very much for coming along to talk to us today, Regan. Over to you.
Thank you very much, really, for this opportunity to engage with you and to discuss aspects relating to prostitution, particularly in view of the bill that was introduced by Ms. Ash Regan. So let me perhaps just frame my engagement on the issue of prostitution. As most of you will know, in June 2024, I presented actually the first and only comprehensive report by any UN entity on the issue of prostitution and how it relates to violence against women and girls. And in it, I emphasized that prostitution is a system of violence against women and girls, and that it gives rise to very serious human rights violations, physical, psychological, economic, but that include things such as torture, cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment, and that violates the right to security, dignity, privacy, the highest attainable standard of health that every person is entitled to, freedom of movement, and the right to family life. What is also relevant to this discussion, and that is part of this framing, is that, of course, I visited the UK, and I visited all the areas covered by devolved authorities, including Scotland. I did the visit in 2024, and I also presented my report in the same session in June 2025. So I mentioned this report because, of course, one of the issues I focused on is also vulnerabilities of women and girls in prostitution, but also I looked at the legal framework. Now, my recommendations and findings addressed the situation as a whole, so it didn't zoom in on Scotland in particularly. But what I want to say is that throughout really the UK, particularly in the areas that haven't adopted the Nordic model, so outside of Northern Ireland, I've identified prostituted women really as a particularly vulnerable group. What I think we need to keep in mind, and perhaps in that sense then also my presence with you is not accidental, is that prostitution and its consequences is very gendered. I know that the bill refers to prostituted persons, or the draft bill, but the reality is, as we have heard also from the previous speaker, that the vast majority of those prostituted are women and girls. And it is very much a sex and gender-based form of violence against women and girls, because also those who buy and pimp them are almost exclusively men, and therefore also the overwhelming majority of prostituted persons are women and girls. And as was said, it's really women and girls who have been facing already multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and inequality that are amongst the most susceptible to entering, to remaining, and to being forced into prostitution, and therefore to experiencing exploitation and violence under it. And many of these women come from marginalized minorities, so racialized women, indigenous women, migrant and refugee women, amongst others. And so this is something I flag because I think any bill needs to recognize this disproportionate and really gendered impact on women and girls in prostitution. Now, in both these reports, the report on my visit to the UK, but also my thematic report to the Human Rights Council on prostitution, I actually recommended the adoption of the Nordic model, or otherwise known as the equality model for prostitution, which, as you know, has many components to it, but two of the most powerful components, I feel, about the Nordic model is, of course, the fact that it criminalizes the purchase of sexual acts, and therefore, in an attempt to push down demand, and also scaling up and providing for exit strategies. In addition to maybe therefore three issues is that it decriminalizes prostituted women. And all of these issues, I think, are under consideration also in the bill before you today and in the coming next weeks. There are a few things I want to say about these important components. One is on the criminalizing demand. So if I understand correctly, the draft bill will apply to persons or buying sexual acts in person. I know this is perhaps to be considered at a later stage, but I have said in my reports that I think criminalizing the buying of sexual acts should not be limited to buying sexual acts in persons, but in fact should be also extended to buying sexual services online. And in fact, Sweden is the first country that has officially extended its Nordic model from just covering physical prostitution to also the online world. In any case, the move to criminalize the buyer of sexual acts is really the game changer in my view, because the buyer is the only one in all of this equation that really has a true and free will. The buyer is the one that decides to buy and can also then desist from buying and does not have any pressures on him to buy. And demand for sexual act is really what drives this exploitative and violent industry. And its negative impact is not just limited to the prostituted women or the girl in prostitution, but it also extends to the wider society, because it normalizes harmful social norms and attitudes. It creates an expectation, particularly among men and boys, that it is very normal, therefore, to commodify women and girls, that this is acceptable. It entrenches gender equality. It furthers violence also in the physical world. It also it creates more legal and economic incentives and room for traffickers, for pimps, and for exploiters. The other thing is, of course, that it blurs the boundaries between also consensual sex and sexual violence. And these are all issues that I've alluded to in my report. And in my report also I cite evidence from about 150 countries that show that legalizing demand and pimping begs more violence and brings more violence, and in fact is not an effective means of protecting women and girls in prostitution. On this issue, I want to also address a point that sometimes comes up, that criminalizing the demand or the buying of sexual act may be inconsistent with a state's international human rights obligation. Fortunately, we are having this discussion later than, or a month later than the decision issued by the European Court of Human Rights, which looked at France's law and looked very specifically at that part of the law that criminalizes the purchase of sexual acts. Because France was sued, claiming that its 2016 law regarding prostitution was incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. But fortunately, I would say, and I think that settles the debate once and for all, particularly for countries, let's say, that are close in their makeup and in their legislation and their approaches to other European countries, is that the court unanimously observed that there is a combined positive effect of decriminalizing the prostituted persons with criminalizing the purchase of sexual acts. And that, and I quote, reverses the balance of power with the buyer of sexual acts for prostituted persons by positioning them as victims and enabling them to denounce the buyers of sexual act in the event of violence, since it is now the latter who is at fault. From the data that we have, and this was also cited just now, criminalizing demand criminalizes buying, discourages demand. And this penalizing of the buyer doesn't have to be limited only to prison sentence. In fact, experience from countries that apply the Nordic model shows that they, in fact, apply other forms of also discouraging demand other than only prison sentences. So, for example, they have adopted fines, they can impose, social work, they can make sure that this is reflected in the criminal record. So all these things will make buyers think twice or thrice before they actually buy sexual acts, because, of course, this will have negative consequences. Another issue I want to briefly address is the assistance for women and girls in prostitution, particularly as part of exit strategies. And as I said, the Nordic models foresees the provision of comprehensive assistance and protection to victims of prostitution. And I think the word protection is key, because assistance without protection makes any support meaningless. As was said before me, most of those that are in prostitution are actually migrant women, amongst others, that have very precarious legal status, and therefore part of proper assistance and exit strategies must include also pathways to legal status security. So they must incorporate safe, independent pathways to legal residence or protection, particularly from deportation, as part of that support. Because if we don't address the immigration status, women may be trapped in exploitation. They will continue to refuse to approach law enforcement or even organizations that may be offering support. And linked to that, authorities must not require victims to report perpetrators or pimps in order to receive that support, as they will, of course, fear retaliation from pimps or from the buyers. We have to keep in mind that many, the vast majority, distrust authorities. They fear arrest and prosecution and punishment and deportation. And then lastly is the issue of course, removing the criminal record if they have received that, or it was put on record for being in prostitution. And finally, I will close with a few words on the issue of consent. And I want to speak to the issue of consent because I'm sure that, and I've heard this repeatedly, that those who object to the buying of sexual acts being criminalized, they often raise this issue. They say that the women in particular, of course, children cannot consent because they're not adults, but they say that women want to engage in prostitution, that they find this empowering, validating, and that it's a choice that is really based on free will. However, speaking of free will or consent in the context of prostitution or pornography is erroneous, is misguided. The vast majority, as was said, of women and girls with lived experience in prostitution actually reject that framing. They feel that framing it as consenting is psychologically manipulative and actually infuriates them because it minimizes the extreme violence and human rights violations that they have endured and continue to endure. And the problem with consent is that it's used as a weapon against prostituted women, and it's often extorted through physical or economic coercion, manipulation, and violence. And so I want to go back to the point I made that actually international law is very clear in that consent is meaningless in situations of exploitation and abuse. And we know, of course, also that within that rationale, victims who can develop strong trauma-based emotional bonds with pimps who control every aspect of their lives through the exploitation of extreme power and violence may also, as a coping mechanism or even as a survival mechanism, convince themselves, at least for some part, that this is what they want. So I will stop here and happy to receive any questions.
Thank you, Regan.
Thank you, Regan. That was interesting. I think it was good the way you've highlighted a number of the key issues that quite often come up in debates. And we'll keep the questions to the end. And I'm, I think, going to ask you to expand a bit about one of the papers that you wrote about the extreme violence that you just mentioned there, and how, and that combined with the surveillance as well, I think in the way that some of these women are treated does constitute torture. So we'll maybe come back to you on that in a second. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But we're going to move on to our next speaker, which is Dr. Claire O'Brien, and she is a legal expert specialising in human rights. So Claire.
Thank you, Ash. I have got slides here. Let's see if they will display. I think that's looking good. Yes, amazing. Okay, well, yeah, thank you. So what I'll talk to today is an opinion, a paper which Ash Regan has requested me to produce, evaluating the consistency with international human rights law of the proposals contained in her bill. No doubt in response to the suggestion that has been made, notwithstanding the recent judgment which Reem Al Salem just referred to of the European Court of Human Rights, finding that France's legislation on similar terms was not inconsistent with the European Convention on Human Rights. It is true that some stakeholders do continue to maintain that legislation on this model constitutes an infringement of human rights, particularly of individuals selling sex. So that's principally the focus of the paper, is to scrutinise whether that's whether there is any basis, or what would be the basis for that in human rights law terms, and contrariwise, whether the proposals in the bill could actually contribute further to realising human rights. Is there a human rights case to be made for this legislation? So the scope of the analysis is international human rights instruments to which the UK is a party. And the focus obviously is on the key provisions of the bill, not looking to the likely realities and resources of how the legislation would be implemented, but in its abstract terms. So focusing on the repeal of the soliciting offence as it currently exists in the law of Scotland, and thereby decriminalising the sale of sex. So that's the terminology that I'll use in the paper and the presentation. The element of quashing historic convictions, and also criminalising the purchase of the sale of sexual acts, as well as, in general, the support to the right to support for exit, although not engaging again because we don't have full facts in terms of how much resources would be made available by the government, or the exact terms in which that right would be given effect, but treating that in an abstract way. The conclusions that I reach, just to cut to the chase, and hopefully you'll be relieved to hear this, are that criminalising the sale of sexual acts, as Scottish law actually does at present, represents a likely breach of the human rights of women. Mm-hmm. Given the discriminatory character of that legislation, when the population of individuals who sell sex are predominantly women and girls. So that represents a potential risk of an ongoing breach of women's human rights under the UN Women's Rights Convention. If the Unbuyable bill was adopted and those offences were repealed, that would therefore represent a contribution to realising human rights and correcting a current breach of international human rights law. Secondly, deregulating the sale and purchase of sexual acts could arguably be inconsistent. So a deregulatory model would arguably be inconsistent with current treaty obligations, given the duties that on the government at the moment to take all reasonable measures to eliminate discrimination and prevent violence against women, to suppress trafficking, and to address other human rights abuses which are experienced by individuals in prostitution. Thirdly, adopting Nordic model style legislation which criminalises the sale of sexual acts does not present a risk of non-compliance with international human rights law. And in particular, I can go into it in a little bit of detail with reference to the European Court of Human Rights case MA in France. Any interference with the right to privacy by legislation which criminalises the purchase of sexual acts while decriminalising their sale is likely to be assessed as lawful by the European Court of Human Rights and other supervisory mechanisms internationally. So overall, the measures contained in the bill would actually reduce the risk of non-compliance with the UK's international human rights obligations and contribute to fulfilling those obligations. So this would be a positive step forward in human rights terms. So just to go into a little bit more depth in terms of what are the international human rights obligations which are relevant to assessing these proposals. Well, the first, of course, relates generally. The first set of rights that are relevant here are, in general, the rights of all individuals to life, bodily integrity and security, freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment, and forced labour, which connects with trafficking, as well as sexual assault. And government obligations in relation to those rights entail that they must themselves not be complicit in conduct or practices which result in those abuses of those rights. They have to enforce and enact criminal and other laws to prevent violent and sexual crime, all forms of trafficking, and coerced labour. They have to adopt measures to prevent discriminatory patterns of violence between women and men. And where they fail to take reasonable measures, which applies to the UK and the Scottish Government, to prevent or respond to violence and the risk of those to individuals, this is a breach of their legal duties under human rights law. So they have to exercise what we call due diligence to prevent individuals from reasonably foreseeable human rights abuses. So that's the general situation in terms of government obligations to protect individuals' human rights, including where it's private actors, other individuals in society, in this context, the buyers of sexual acts, who present the immediate risk of harm. So rape and sexual assault obviously are grave human rights violations in the context of prostitution, whether it's legal or illegal under domestic law. The effective prosecution of rape and other sexual violence and assault faces many hurdles, which are made, as I think the first speaker, Ruth, said, prostitution can't be made safe in any legal environment. And as women and girls are disproportionately the victims of rape and sexual assault, they are analysed as, in human rights terms, as gender-based violence, which is a form of systemic discrimination against women and a violation of women's right to substantive equality with men. So given that and the known risks to individuals in prostitution of being exposed to those kinds of human rights abuses, government duties towards that population of individuals are heightened. So the due diligence obligation on the state is more extensive, where you have a population of individuals which it's known in advance are exposed to a higher risk than the average of being victims of those kinds of human rights abuses. And government and social tolerance of violence against women, whether in the context of prostitution or otherwise, and whether it's occurring as a public or as a private matter, in human rights law terms, is said to facilitate the wider persistence of violence against women and sex discrimination, and is a form of impunity for human rights abuses. So that explains why in the UN Women's Convention, Article 6 requires that states take all appropriate measures, including legislation to suppress all forms of traffic in women and the exploitation of prostitution of women. And that, of course, provides the context for the report which Remal Salem spoke to of hers from 2024 on prostitution and the analysis that she advances there. So more specifically, and I think Ruth's presentation in terms of it, the detailed research and facts that she spoke to very well demonstrated why this is the case. That in relation to Article 6, trafficking is seen as a source of, prostitution is seen as a source of demand for trafficked persons in international human rights law, and therefore a root cause of trafficking. That's also recognised in the Palermo Protocol as well as CEDAW, and therefore it can be argued that permitting the purchase of sex creates a compliance risk in terms of those provisions of CEDAW in relation to the obligation on states to take all measures necessary to suppress demand for trafficked persons. And that's also in line with obligations under the Council of Europe Anti-Trafficking Convention. So that set of obligations around anti-trafficking are one rationale for the position that I set out at the beginning. A second is international labour standards, which don't usually get referred to in the sort of analysis and discussion around prostitution. But the fact is that prostitution has never been recognised as decent work by the International Labour Organization. International labour organisations are binding on the UK, as they are on all ILO member states. Core labour standards refer to freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, forced labour, child labour and sexual discrimination. In addition, we have the Convention 190 of the ILO. It's a recently adopted instrument, which again, the UK is a party, which sets out state obligations in relation to violence and harassment, which includes violence and harassment on the basis of gender, which is unacceptable and incompatible with decent work. In particular, under Convention 190 of the ILO, violence and harassment in the world of work is said to refer to a range of unacceptable behaviours and practices, or the threat thereof, whether a single occurrence or repeatedly, that result in physical, psychological, sexual or economic harm, and that includes gender-based violence and harassment. And the term gender-based violence and harassment in ILO Convention 190 means violence and harassment directed at persons because of their sex or gender, or affecting persons of a particular sex or gender disproportionately, and which includes sexual harassment. So it's very hard, obviously, to see, given what we know about who is engaged in prostitution, how prostitution can be seen as consistent with Convention 190. That gives states a duty to identify, under that particular convention, sectors or occupations and work arrangements in which workers and other persons concerned are more exposed to violence and harassment. Again, that quite firmly puts prostitution into that category, in relation to which states have a duty to take other measures effectively to protect such persons. Goes again to what Regan was saying about the protective obligations of the state. I could say more about that, but I won't, in terms of for the purposes of time. But I think useful to highlight that does provide some of the reason, as well as the very clear and immediate obligations around child prostitution as to why it's never been regarded as decent work within the ILO framework, notwithstanding the variable approaches that individual states take to regulating prostitution. Mm-hmm. In terms of the Nordic model, then, just to get to say a little bit more about the case which Regan Salem referred to, MA and others in France. As Regan mentioned, this was a direct challenge by a large group of applicants of very diverse national backgrounds, with support from NGOs at the French level, which sought to challenge France's Nordic model legislation. And what's, I think, interesting for us in this context is that it goes beyond, far beyond what the European Court had dealt with previously in terms of its case law relating to prostitution. Previous case law only really dealt with matters concerning trafficked persons, where of course it was made clear that trafficking and forced labour is a breach of Article 4 of the European Convention. And in that case law, the court recognises the realities of coercion in the context of trafficking and trafficking for prostitution. But in MA and France, the key argument advanced was that criminalising prostitution infringed the personal autonomy and sexual freedom of the applicants, that it had diminished the demand for their services, thereby decreasing their incomes, causing them financial insecurity, causing them to engage in unsafe, from a health point of view, practices, and increased their exposure to violence and rape by forcing them into secrecy and resorting to online solicitation because of diminished street demand. And they also criticised the terms and the realities of exit programs for individuals based in prostitution as inadequate. And the French government, in response, argued the legislation was required to meet their positive obligations to protect, which I tried to outline briefly at the beginning, against breaches of the right to life, against inhuman and degrading treatment, and freedom from forced labour and slavery. Now, the court chose to analyse the claims only with reference to Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, largely for factual reasons. There was no applicant who had alleged or far less been able to prove that they had experienced homicide or rape or serious sexual assault directly because of the legislation. That wasn't the basis on which any of the applicants had advanced the case. It was more of a general challenge to the legislation per se and its sort of diffuse effect. So for that reason, the court chose to analyse the whole set of applications just with reference to the right to privacy. And the court rejected the applications unanimously. It was a grand chamber judgment because, according to the court, firstly, it was unnecessary to decide the claim to determine whether prostitution can be freely consented to or always results from coercion. So they left that to one side. And even leaving that to one side, they found that while acknowledging personal autonomy can and in law, in the human rights law, extends to choice about how you exercise your sexual freedom, that principle did not apply in the context of prostitution. Where here what's at stake is the ability to engage in prostitution as a professional or economic activity rather than to engage in specific sexual acts at all. So what you'll see sometimes in stakeholder submissions is the suggestion that because there's cases before the Human Rights Committee in the UN, for example, the case of Tunin, which say, yes, we have a right to privacy, which entails sexual freedom, therefore it's wrong for states to criminalize homosexuality. That right to engage in whatever sexual activity you wish reads across to the context where you're doing that as an economic activity. So the context is crucial. The contextual difference is crucial, but that's not always signaled or acknowledged in the other argumentation you might see about this from a sort of sex work is work point of view. So the French law, the court found, pursued a legitimate aim within the meaning of Article 8.2 of the Convention. It was part of a comprehensive framework to combat the practice of prostitution. It sought to eliminate demand for prostitution and to eliminate human trafficking networks by penalising purchasers of sexual acts, pimping and sexual exploitation, which the court described as activities which are based on the coercion and enslavement of human beings. And it sought to ensure the safeguarding of human dignity, to preserve public order and prevent crime. And as a matter of high social importance for the court, where there was no, as matters stand, no legislative approach that was yet free from controversy, the court found it was bound to apply a broad margin of appreciation. So that means they give states wide latitude in deciding how to regulate these matters. And on that basis, the court found that any interference with Article 8 was proportionate to the aims pursued. And in that context, the court noted the unanimous support of all the parties and the interveners for decriminalising the sale of sexual acts. Noted also that the law sought to reverse the power dynamic for victims of violence linked to prostitution by enabling them to denounce clients. So that was something that the court found relevant. That it included measures to combat social stigma for individuals in prostitution and strengthening access to rights and protective measures. And also that eventually the sale of sexual acts by individuals itself was still not subject to criminal prohibition. So the court took into account all those elements. And furthermore, the court found that even though the applicants had alleged that the resources allocated to supporting exit were not adequate, that was not sufficient to undermine the French law in light of the legitimate aims that it pursued, particularly, and this is a quote from the judgment, particularly when this choice by France aims to bring about profound societal changes whose effects only fully unfold over time. So what's behind that is the fact that, we don't know, no one knows, whether prostitution would persist under perfect social conditions where everybody had, from the beginning of their life on the planet, sufficient resources, support, in the course of their development as children and into adulthood. No one knows yet whether prostitution would persist in that environment or not. And given that in reality, the situation is very different and the strong association between prostitution and a whole host of rights abuses, it's completely legitimate for states to try to abolish it completely.
Okay. We'll have to
so that,
because we're running out of time.
Oh, we're running out of time. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so that I think provides a very strong footing for the conclusion that the bill that's proposed in the Scottish context, as I said at the beginning, is fully consistent with human rights law, would reduce risk of non-compliance and actually advance the realisation of human rights.
Thank you very much, Claire. We are slightly running out of time, but I want to move on to our next speaker. I fully understand if anyone who's in the room or online needs to leave to go and attend to something else. I think we'll just carry on if we can for the next few minutes. So I'd like to introduce Vanessa, and Vanessa is a survivor of the Scottish sex trade. She's going to speak to us next. Thanks, Vanessa.
My name is Vanessa, and as a survivor of the Scottish sex industry, I'm probably the only person in this room that can tell you how it feels to be raped by men in exchange for money. Now, at 17, most kids are learning to drive. They're buying their first car, or looking for their first job, or fretting over which university to attend. But at that age, my life looked very different. At 17, under the threat of being homeless for a second time, someone that I considered a friend took advantage of my desperation and sold me to a man who was old enough to be my grandfather. He was the manager of a brothel in Edinburgh, places that are colloquially known as saunas. So when I was young, naive and desperate, the revolving door of nameless men that paid to use my body were titillated by my barely legal age. It thrilled them to purchase a child, to play out their fantasies on a girl who couldn't legally buy a glass of wine. It excited them to act without any consequences for their actions. And for one of those men, even 17 was not young enough. For him, I was forced to pretend that I was his 6-year-old sister as he held me down and used me. The uncomfortable truth is that it's not just billionaires, princes, and pop stars that pay to use women's bodies. These men are not boogeymen. They're amongst us. They're our fathers, our uncles, and our husbands. They come from all demographics, all ages, all backgrounds, and all socio-economic statuses. For an insight to how these men perceive the woman that they purchase, let's allow the punters a moment to speak for themselves. Let's examine some prostitute reviews from websites such as Punternet. One reviewer says, "I climb on top. She's avoiding eye contact and is lying motionless while I fuck her and think about something better than the thing on the bed." Another punter writes, "She kept saying and moaning that I was hurting her. So I carried on in different positions." Another reviewer says that she was completely uncommunicative. She shoved loads of lube up her fanny, and it became clear that this could only be the wank into a body of a girl. These are by no means an extensive collection of dehumanizing reviews of women, nor are they the worst of the reviews that you will find on these websites. The men who buy women's bodies perceive them as purchased properties, and from the reviews, I think we've established that they don't care about the woman that they purchase. But I do. I care about them because I know exactly what they are going through. Some of them are less than a mile from where we are sitting today, and they are being drugged, they are being raped, they are being beaten, they are being kidnapped, and some of them are being tortured. Every fibre of my being remembers how this treatment made me feel. Even 15 years later, it still haunts me. After I escaped, I couldn't leave my house for 7 years. I still have PTSD and panic attacks that are so severe that some days it feels impossible just to survive as a human being because I am drowning in trauma and flashbacks and fear. Sometimes all it takes is a man looking at me and I am transported back to that room. I'm chained to that bed and I'm reminded that I am nothing more than an object for him to use again and again until he is satisfied. I don't want that future for our girls. And frankly, I think they deserve a lot better than that. As I see it, there are 3 choices in front of us as a country. The first one is to decriminalise sex work, but make no mistake, this would be absolutely catastrophic for our society and the women and girls in it, because it makes exploitation easier and not harder. Arguments that proclaim this is the safest route and would stop it from going further underground, I find particularly offensive, because the sauna that I was in was pretty much legal. At the time, we were a licensed venue by the council as an entertainment venue, and we had every security measure that we possibly could have. We had a buzzer door entry system with CCTV, we had a sign-in system, we had a receptionist who was always on site, we had panic buttons in our individual rooms, and at least 3 other girls on the premises who promised to run to your aid if something went wrong. But still, we were raped and subjected to violence because prostitution at its core is dehumanizing and violent. Our second option here is to do nothing, and in that case, nothing changes. Respectfully, I think that some members of Parliament are working on the premises that it's out of sight, out of mind. If they can't see the problem or they don't contribute to the problem, then they don't have to fix the problem. Well, I'm here today to remind you that this is a problem. Whether you see it or not, it is happening in our country, and we do have to fix it. Because until we do, women and girls will continue to go through this meat grinder, and they will have their lives destroyed by these men for the pleasure of these men. That brings me on to our last option, which is to do something radical and hold these men accountable for their actions. Pass this bill and change the law. Restore safety, dignity, and respect to these women's lives by giving them safe, feasible options to exit prostitution, because as it stands, the law still says that I, the child, the 17-year-old homeless girl who trusted the wrong person, that I'm the one who should feel ashamed, should be shunned, and I should be punished. Meanwhile, the men who paid to inflict physical, mental, sexual, and lasting psychological torture onto another human being should be absolved of all responsibility in the eyes of the law. Our legislation needs to reflect that Scotland will hold these perpetrators accountable, just like our Nordic neighbours do. I mean, they are a testament that this works and it can be done. In 1778, almost 250 years ago, we said no to buying human beings by listening to the lived experiences of a man named Joseph Knight. Back then, Scotland paved the way and abolished the ownership of enslaved people in this country. So why, in 2026, is it still legally acceptable to rent their genitalia? Lastly, I want to say that prostitution is such an easy issue to theorize about, because for the majority of us, it is so far away from our daily lives and realities. So I want everybody to stop and think about the women in your lives, because in the right circumstances, it could have been any one of them that ended up in that room. I'm not special. Ask yourself, would you really want a revolving door of men to use your mother's mouth, your aunt's anus, or your daughter's vagina in exchange for money? Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Okay, I know we're over time, but as no one has appeared to throw us out, I suggest we carry on for another few minutes just for an opportunity for questions and discussions. So if anybody wants to ask a question, I'll ask Maren and Anna to have a look and see if there's any online questions, but I'll start with the room. Katie.
Thank you very much, Ash, and I've got a question at half 2 in education portfolio, so apologies if I leave the meeting early. I'm one of the Labour members on the Criminal Justice Committee, along with Pauline McNeill, who was here earlier. Pauline left the Shadow Cabinet to come into the meeting and has gone back to the Shadow Cabinet, so otherwise she would be here too. I mean, obviously I can't say anything about the discussions within the committee because that's seen as very much inappropriate, but one of the issues that has come up quite a lot, I think it's fair to say, as we've taken evidence as a committee looking at this bill, is this issue of checks and this argument that's been advanced that the Nordic model actually increases violence against women who are involved in the sector selling sex. And it would be helpful really to get a response to that. And I was particularly interested that there was a speaker from Northern Ireland because there's a standard email going to MSPs this week. I don't know, Ash, if you've had it as well. I think it's from Scotland for Decrim, but they're asking people to send this standard email in, and it refers to the Northern Ireland situation and says that in a 2019 review commissioned by the Northern Ireland Ministry of Justice, the policy of criminalising the purchase of sexual services in Northern Ireland was what they're saying is shown to be an abject failure, and the reported assaults against sex workers increased by 225% from 2026 to 2018. So that's a specific figure that's been given to us, but this argument that the Nordic model actually makes it more difficult for women involved in prostitution because it gives them less time to check whether it's a safe punter is an argument that's being advanced repeatedly, and it would be helpful to get as much information about that as possible.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think we have touched on that. I think all the speakers have touched on that issue of safety. But I'll perhaps, if it's okay, Vanessa, you take the one about how you would maybe do checks on punters and whether that's a realistic approach or not, and then I'll perhaps direct the Northern Irish report perhaps to Ruth, who could speak to that for us in a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only speak to my own experience, but as I briefly touched on there, we did have so-called checks in place. These men turned up at the door. There were buzzer entry systems, so there was 2 double doors. They had to be buzzed through both of them, and there was CCTV outside. They were to give a name at the desk, and they could make up whatever name under the sun they so fancied. If you'd asked these men to hand their ID over, there is no way they would ever do such a thing. It's just unrealistic. I'm sorry, it just wouldn't happen in a million years. Part of the thrill for them is being anonymous. I think as we touched on as well, many of these men have families, they are married, and as it stands, there are no consequences for their actions. So why would they hand their name over?
That's an interesting perspective because, of course, that was in a full intents and purposes a legal brothel. So you can imagine once you get further away from that into more coercion, the chances of any kind of meaningful checks being carried out are less than zero, I would imagine. Ruth, do you want to add something to that about the various reports on Northern Ireland and Ireland?
So one of the things that we would have attempted to track over the period of time that we were gathering data from women in prostitution, we had data from before the law came into place in Ireland in 2017 and data subsequently. And what we saw is that the level of violence remained high but steady both before and after the legislation. Because of the point that I made earlier, that this is an inherently violent system and that buyers, as part of their interactions with women, are absolutely, using violence within that interaction. The law, I suppose there's a question of this idea of why would buyers suddenly become more violent when their actions are criminalised. The fact of the matter is what we found in Ireland is actually buyers are more circumspect and careful in their actions. They don't go out on a violent rampage just because what they're doing has been outlawed. So I think that this is a kind of a talking point that is, you know, very much pushed by those who lobby for the full decriminalisation, that the law suddenly increases, and you know, there's this startling increase in violence. When we were preparing for our review in the Republic of Ireland, we had an eminent law professor who set out a number of criteria for what evidence that review should consider, and one of those criteria was that it shouldn't be influenced by data that is provided by those with direct links to the sex trade. Essentially, there shouldn't be data provided into the review by those who actually profit from the sex trade, the likes of pimps, traffickers, and the advertising websites. But unfortunately, that criteria was not met in Northern Ireland in the review of the Northern Ireland legislation. So the data that's being referred to there is being supplied almost directly from the advertising website in Northern Ireland. So I feel that it isn't credible in this case. It doesn't stand up. This huge increase in violence is a red herring. That's not what happened. And then I would just say, finally on the point of vetting, much of prostitution now, certainly in Ireland, has moved, you know, from an outdoor location from the street into indoors. So at the end of the day, when you're in a brothel in prostitution, it's you and usually a man who's larger and stronger than you in a room behind a closed door. So at that point, vetting can't happen any further anyway. Do you know what I mean? What he says goes in that room. And also I'd ask the wider question of, why are we suggesting that there should be jobs for a particular cohort of women where panic alarms are required, where vetting is required because rape is a risk? Why are we accepting that there's a job where rape is a day-to-day risk for women? I mean, I think that's a larger question, and what perhaps this legislation is trying to work towards. Thank you.
Thank you. Online question, go ahead.
It's not a question, but may I contribute to this question?
Of course, Regan, go ahead.
Yeah, without delving into the specificities of Northern Ireland, as Ruth has already done so, but one of my findings also about the Nordic model is, for it to really work, it has to be applied and implemented in its entirety. So all the components have to be implemented. You cannot pick and choose. And that also means that the state and the authorities have to also dedicate sufficient resources to all the components, including exit strategies. Now, as Vanessa has said, Scotland would not be the first nor the only country if it were to adopt the measures that are foreseen in the law. And in fact, one of the documents that I've also produced, and I'm happy to make them available, is the lessons learned from the many exit strategies that states have applied. So states have applied many of these provisions. There is experience there that Scotland can learn from. Now, the other thing I want to go back to is that, as I said, a lot of prostitution has also moved online. This is very much a reality. So yes, the effectiveness of the Nordic model is hampered by the fact that what applies on physical prostitution does not apply on online prostitution. And online prostitution is a crime scene. The internet, AI-generated content, it's very much a place that normalizes and encourages sexual violence. So that could also be something to consider.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions or comments? Yeah.
Well, just to come back on that point again, I mean, even if it were the case that there was a short-term increase in the incidence of assault, that from a human rights law standpoint would still be compatible with the measure in question, because the whole point of this is to try to decrease the numbers of individuals entering prostitution, decreasing the number of individuals trafficked for the purposes of prostitution and disrupt trafficking networks, decrease the demand through the impact on the behaviour of individual buyers and social norms around buying sex, and to attack negative gender stereotypes which lead to the acceptability. None of those things you're going to be able to measure over a short time period, and that was specifically the basis on which the European Court of Human Rights proceeded in the French case. So I don't think it's no criticism, even if it were true, which I think Ruth has suggested, we have reason to suspect may not be the case.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question. If you could explain, one of the papers of yours I read went into detail about the conditions that many of, I think particularly trafficking, women who are victims of trafficking who are held and exploited in prostitution by pimps the levels of violence and constant surveillance that they're held under, you said meets the criteria for torture. I wonder if you could explain that to the people in the room here, please.
Yes, I think Vanessa already said a lot about it, and in fact it would be difficult to add much more to that, but the levels of extreme physical and sexual violence, there are situations of rape, gang rapes, beatings, there are situations of mutilations, torture, forced unprotected sex, lethal violence including femicide, serial killers, serial killings of women in prostitution. You have also victims that are trapped in bondage, in debt bondage. They're exploited financially, they're denied basic services, they have to undergo forced sterilization or forced miscarriages. They have very high rates, therefore, of post-traumatic stress disorder, which produces depression, dissociation, often leads to substance abuse, suicidality, along with physical health consequences such as sexually transmitted infections, infertility, and reduced life expectancy. And then to make things even worse, those that have children, also then their children suffer. Often they are separated from their children, they have to give them up, but also the children themselves will suffer developmental harm. They will suffer abuse, neglect, they may also be trafficked and abused, they may even be killed. So looking at the totality of all these acts, it's really difficult not to see this as torture.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Right, last opportunity. Anyone want to? Yeah, Susan.
It's just really an observation, because this is obviously always a very upsetting conversation. Today, the Scottish Government, was revealed in the press, are going to argue that removing male murderers from female prisons is an infringement on their human rights. And I think it is about time the Scottish Government answered the question, what about the human rights of women who are prostituted and trafficked? Because they don't seem to give a damn about that. Sorry.
Yeah, did you have your microphone on there? I'll just summarise. That was really a question asking that it was about time really that the Scottish Government think carefully about the human rights of women that are exposed to prostitution. So I think we'd all agree with that. And I think that might be our note to finish on. So I want to thank, in fact, I think we should do a round of applause to all of our speakers. Oh, did Ruth want to say something? Go ahead, Ruth.
Sorry, Ash, just very quickly, I wanted to say thank you to everyone, but especially to Vanessa, because that was incredibly powerful. And I think that you're recording this session, is that right? I think you're recording it. I mean, even just for every legislator who's tasked with deciding on this legislation, even to just hear Vanessa's input, I think would be incredibly powerful, because, this is somebody with lived experience, they're the expert in their experiences. And I just think it'd be really important for legislators to hear from Vanessa. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ruth. Okay, thank you everyone for attending. Thanks very much.